Hello, in this video we're going to look at how to use Perplexity Comet browser with REST API. And so we opened the Assistant tab and asked what are the common REST API calls for Canvas. Now developers typically remember these calls. Each call can operate some data inside of Canvas. So there might be a call that shows membership of a class. There might be an endpoint that talks about who the user is. So we're asking, show me user endpoint. So now we're going to narrow down specifically to maybe doing something with user information. Now this Canvas system is the free edition where you can try Canvas for teachers, and so this is not an enterprise organizational account. But we are going to perform a user call to show the data in the browser. So what we're doing now is we're asking Perplexity to open the hood and show us what REST API actually looks like. And so REST API is JSON data, so it's a structured data that is going to be sent to the server and the server will reply. So that's how backends typically communicate. The beautiful thing about working with REST API and not just buttons is that REST API can typically do more and it can be much faster. Because with buttons you gotta wait for save and something else happens on the screen. You have to re-navigate, and none of that happens with API. Okay, and so now we're going to say this: add an announcement in my course, but use REST API only. Alright, so now we're saying don't use buttons, but create this announcement through the back door. That's important to note that we have the privileges to do this because they're inherent to how the browser works. So as you click on buttons, a lot of these buttons will activate REST API, and the REST API talks to the data in Canvas. So we are simply using the same permissions as Canvas itself is using. So there's no security breach here, in other words. Alright, so now we are looking at the announcement space, and on the left here we have the user interface. So if Perplexity wanted to simply use user interface, it could have put in the name of the announcement, the text of it, and then save it. But we asked it to use REST API, so it needs to design a REST API call. Typically this would be either a put or a post call. That's all clarified in documentation, and it happens behind the scenes, and then the user interface does its own REST API call to pull the data back and show it to us. And so there it is, test announcement from API, and it's worked out really well. Alright, and again we're saying thank you because we love to be polite to AI, because that's what makes us human, and we do not want to forget that. So next, using REST API, change my name to John Doe. Now this should be a fairly straightforward change. The user endpoint API is fairly simple. You can use application like Postman and call API directly. So what's happening now is the assistant is working out what screens it has available. If necessary, it's going to start looking up documentation, but it's already using REST API to check what is in my profile. So even though we saw the profile with buttons, with user interface, we also saw just the straight text, and that's the JSON structure. So JSON is basically structure where each field is separated, and you can easily navigate through that structure. And now we're looking at documentation. So the assistant wants to ensure that its API calls are correct. Now this is what developers would usually do. You look through documentation, try to figure out which call is the appropriate for the activity. Now each call might take specific parameters. For example, when you have a user call, you need to provide an ID of that user, and in return you'll get their first name, last name, and other elements of their profile. So this is what the assistant is currently working out. And notice that we call it an assistant, where we would actually call it probably an agent today, because it is independent, it works relatively well. Note what happened here. The name was populated, the name was changed, and this was all done in the user interface. I believe that what's happened here is the assistant actually took a shortcut, and it actually manipulated the data right in the user interface, then saved it, and then verified that the API did return John Doe. I attempted to argue with it later to ask it why it completed this in the interface instead of using REST API, but it couldn't quite remember all the details. So what we've seen here momentarily was that it ran into a little bit of a difficulty getting the REST API to work. So it tried it. It then looked at the buttons and fields. It updated the buttons and fields, and now it continues to work things out. And its answer now is your name was successfully updated to John Doe. I responded, it looked to me like you used the UI to change my name. Is that right? Oh, no, I used the Canvas REST API. Now, honestly, it could be that it both was done, because we do not hear keys clicking, so I wouldn't know if it actually was clicking on keys, or did it just send the REST API. Obviously, what we're looking at right now is a JSON that needs to be submitted, and it's submitted in the correct format. So it might be that simply it's done so fast that that I did not register it well. But you can argue with it, and you can ask for another demonstration there. So as I looked at the results, the name that was changed was changed only in one section. So I think that's where we're going to go next. So display my original request about the name change, and it only changed my name in the short name area. And so now we're kind of figuring out, clarifying what my request was, and I can request for it to go back and fix it. So I intended for my entire name to change. Of course, in Canvas, the way name is handled is not quite straightforward. As you type in first and last name, it is divided automatically for you. But obviously I should have been more specific as to how I wanted this REST API change to take place. Alright, so now I said update my name in all fields to John Doe, and it's preparing on the left the JSON, so that's the data that will be sent. And we can confirm here that the full name is still my name. Alright, and so now it's working through it. All right, yeah, so it's making the change. I suppose one way to tell the difference between REST API calls and user interface calls is that if you put in first and last name through the UI, you have to press the submit button because it's the user interface that then carries this data to the server. With REST API, as soon as you put or post the values, these values are going to be saved. So that might be one way to separate this these two methods of work here. And I love how I continue to insist that the REST API was not used, and the agent continues to be kind of defensive about it. And what I ended up finding as I scrolled up through the thinking area was that it indeed was filling out the form in the UI. So it probably was going for the easiest way to do this because the end result is exactly the same, right? That is the power of REST API and Comet's ability to work with it, that now accessibility is no longer an issue because the interfaces, the UI is skipped altogether. We are engaging with the business layer, with a middle tier, the business logic directly without having to use buttons and fields. It is a huge step forward. So the idea that you can have a browser, there are other tools like Postman, right, where you can test and you can do similar things, but here you can really explain what you want to have done, and multiple calls are made to get this accomplished. So whether this is being done for testing, maybe it's done to find security issues, or again, maybe it's done as a way for developers to explore what it is that they need to change. But just a beautiful tool, a tool that can be very, very useful. And now, for the end, we're going to generate a REST API key. Now, this is important because so far we were using the browser session and our standard access to REST API. Now, that is all expected, and we are logged in, we provided user and password. With what's happening right now, where we create an access token, we could be in a different country altogether, and this token is the key to our user. Now, I already deleted the token, so don't worry, you don't have to write it down. But this particular token from far away can send a message and operate our account. That's how LTI tools are built. So now that Comet generated this token, we could start working on code that will run independently altogether of the Comet browser. So it could be code that's checking on my grades. It could be code that is putting in discussion forums. Anything a human can do, the REST API can do. And we just generated the token on the free version of Instructure Canvas. And now, just as a cherry, we are adding a request to create JavaScript, so something that you can just save on the desktop of your computer and open with a browser. And this JavaScript will connect to the Canvas instance and use the REST API call and the token that we created. Beautiful things, very exciting, and we'll see you at our next video.